What if I told you that you are living in a world built for someone else? A world where every doorway you walk through and every ceiling you stand beneath was never meant for your height. While researching 19th century architecture, I found a photograph of Philadelphia City Hall that stopped me cold. The doorways were 13 feet tall, ornate, massive, and completely impractical for a human being. As I looked closer, the glitch became a global contagion. From London to Melbourne, I saw orphanages with 12-foot doors for abandoned children who couldn't even reach the handles and furniture scaled for bodies that simply do not exist in our history books. The official explanation says this was just architectural style, but style doesn't explain why you would triple your heating costs and engineer massive structural complications for no reason. This isn't just a design choice, it is an inheritance. There is a name that has been systematically scrubbed from our maps and our memories, a global civilization called Tartaria that once commanded the very ground you are standing on. Between 1850 and 1920, thousands of these impossibly scaled buildings appeared simultaneously across 6 continents. And then, just as suddenly, the people they were built for vanished. We didn't build these cities. We moved into them, lowered the ceilings, and wrote a new history to hide the fact that we are just the smaller occupants of a world we inherited from giants. But if you look at the maintenance records from the early 1900s, you will see the invoices for the quiet, systematic work of shrinking our world to fit us, leaving behind a haunting question that the textbooks refuse to answer. Who were we taught to forget, and why are we still walking through their doors? Let us take a walk through the streets we think we know, past the limestone and granite giants that stand like silent witnesses in our modern centers. To understand the scale of this impossibility, we have to look at what exists undeniably in our cities today. Look at Grand Central Terminal in New York, where the windows soar 60 feet into the sky. Travel to the Kelty railway station in Budapest, and you will find doorways so massive you could drive a carriage through them standing up. Or stand beneath the ceilings of the Palacio de Correos in Mexico City, which dwarf anyone standing beneath them, all for a simple post office. The official history books give us a very neat, very safe label. They call it the neoclassical revival or the Beaux-Arts movement. They tell us it was all for architectural ambition, a way to inspire the public. But as an investigator, I have to tell you that the official explanation collapses under its own weight. Style is a choice, but engineering is a necessity. You do not add an extra 6 feet to every doorway and triple your glass and heating costs just for a look. You do not excavate deeper foundations and create massive structural complications that make buildings exponentially more expensive simply because it looks nice. It defies every rule of economic logic we have ever known. If these buildings were for us, they were the most inefficient designs in human history. But if they were an inheritance from Tartaria, the proportions finally make sense. This isn't just limited to grand public monuments. Look at the residential architecture that we still inhabit today. In St. Petersburg, ordinary apartment buildings feature 15-foot doorways. In the Back Bay area of Boston, there are townhouses where the ground floor windows begin 8 feet off the pavement, as if the eyes they were meant for were positioned much higher than our own. Go to San Francisco, Chicago, or Montreal, and you will find ordinary commercial buildings where the first floor alone has 20-foot ceilings. Every time we try to force these structures into the narrative of 19th century human ambition, we find ourselves with too much empty space, too much height, and a scale that makes us feel like uninvited guests in our own homes. We are told these were built by horse and buggy civilizations, yet they possessed a mastery of stone and volume that we struggle to replicate today. Once you stop looking at the decoration and start looking at the math, you realize the math is screaming that we were never the intended users. If you have made it this far, you are probably thinking that old buildings are just grand by design and that the scale is merely a theatrical flourish of a bygone era. But the architecture is only half the story. The real proof is hidden in the objects that were meant to fill that empty space. When you pivot from the limestone walls to the mahogany and oak of the 1800s, the official narrative of Tartaria being a myth starts to crumble under the weight of a dining table. If you look at the original furniture catalogs from the 19th century, not the miniature reproductions we use in our homes today, but the authentic originals, the proportions are staggering. We find beds that are 8 feet long and chairs with seats that sit 3 feet off the ground. Think about that for a second. A modern person would have to climb into a chair like a toddler just to sit down. We see dining tables where an average adult today would struggle to even reach their plate. There are desks built with a height and depth that would only be comfortable for someone standing 7, 8, or even 9 feet tall. Now, the common rebuttal is that rich people simply like big, imposing furniture to show off their wealth. But that logic fails when you consider basic human comfort. Why would any sane person commission a chair they needed a step stool to sit in? Why would you buy a bed you would rattle around in like a small child in a king-sized expanse? These were not museum pieces locked away for display. These were residential items designed for daily use. They were the tools of a living, breathing population. When you see a desk that fits a 9-foot frame perfectly, you aren't looking at a status symbol. You are looking at an ergonomic necessity for a body that history tells us didn't exist. This is where the scale becomes impossible to ignore because furniture is intimate. It tells us exactly how long a leg was, how wide a reach was, and how tall a torso sat. We are walking through their halls and looking at their chairs, and the ghost of a much larger civilization is sitting right there in front of us, waiting for us to notice that the world we inhabit was never tailored for us. As we pull back from the intimate details of a single chair or a lonely doorway, a much larger and more unsettling pattern begins to emerge across the map of our world. This wasn't a slow, local evolution of style that happened over centuries. Instead, we see a remarkably compressed explosion of these massive structures occurring between 1850 and 1920. In a window of just 70 years, cities across 6 continents, separated by vast oceans, impassable mountain ranges, and deep political hostilities, all independently decided to build exactly the same way. We are told that these cultures had no contact, no shared building codes, and no reason to cooperate, yet they all began installing ceilings between 15 and 40 feet high, as if by some invisible, universal command. They installed doorways averaging 10 to 14 feet and manufactured window proportions that required massive glass panes up to 20 feet tall. They even incorporated complex ventilation systems that suggest a physical need for much larger lung capacities than we possess today. Think about the sheer logistical nightmare of this for a moment. In an era where we are told the primary mode of transport was the horse and carriage, how did architects in San Francisco, Paris, and Mumbai all arrive at the same impossible scale at the exact same time? The official narrative wants us to believe this happened organically, that different empires with different motivations just happened to share the same obsession with giantism. But logic tells us that organic growth is messy and slow. What we see here is a worldwide standardization of grandeur that defies the primitive technology of the Industrial Revolution. It is as if a pre-existing infrastructure was being activated or reclaimed globally. These buildings, which we are told are the height of human Victorian achievement, actually represent a mysterious convergence that suggests a single, unified influence. It is the signature of Tartaria, written in stone and glass across the entire surface of the earth, right before the modern world moved in to claim the credit. We see the same grand staircases with risers too tall for modern human biomechanics appearing in every major capital, forcing us to ask if we were witnessing the final golden age of a different species rather than the beginning of our own. The timeline doesn't lie. It shows a world that was already built to a specific, massive scale before we ever arrived to pick up the tools. If you really want to find the truth, You have to look at the things that cannot lie. And in the world of architecture, staircases are the ultimate witness. While a doorway can be wide for purely aesthetic reasons, a staircase is a mathematical map of the body that uses it. Modern building codes are very specific. The maximum riser height is set at 7.75 inches because human biomechanics are consistent. Our legs are only so long, and our natural stride is fixed by our biology. Yet when you walk into these grand structures built during that mysterious 70-year window, the math suddenly stops making sense for us. You will find grand staircases with risers that are 12 inches or even 14 inches high. For an average person today, these aren't steps you walk up. They are steps you have to genuinely climb. It is physically exhausting and biomechanically incorrect for the human frame, which raises a chilling question. Who was this primary stride designed for? Here is the real twist that makes the Tartaria theory impossible to ignore. Many of these buildings actually operate on two completely different scales of architecture at the same time. If you go to the back of the building, the servant staircases and secondary access points have perfectly normal proportions, 7-inch risers and human-scale doors that we fit into comfortably. But the moment you move into the primary halls, the scale explodes into something meant for a giant. It is a chilling realization that we have been told these massive entrances were for prestige, when the physical evidence suggests they were simply the standard entrances for the actual owners, while we were relegated to the crawl spaces built for our size. Once you see this dual-scale reality, you cannot unsee it. We are living in a world with two sets of rules, one for the people who ostensibly inherited these structures, and one for the population that actually engineered them to fit a much larger, more powerful physical form. We are walking through their front doors on our tiptoes, trying to pretend the scale was meant for us all along. This is where the investigation turns from architectural curiosity into something much darker and more personal, because if you have the buildings and you have the furniture, you eventually have to find the people. For decades, we have been told that exceptionally tall individuals in the 19th century were mere medical anomalies, carnival tricks and sideshow attractions meant to draw a crowd. But the photographs tell a different story. Take a look at Captain Martin Van Buren Bates and his wife, Anna Swan. He stood 7 feet 11 inches tall, and she was 7 feet 5 inches. When you find their portraits from the 1870s, look at what they are wearing. They aren't in performance costumes or exaggerated attire. They are dressed in standard, high-quality Victorian fashion. They are wearing suits that fit perfectly and dresses with proper proportions, as if a local tailor didn't find their size unusual at all. It makes you wonder if it was actually normal to see people twice the average height walking down a street built to their scale. These weren't suffering, misshapen individuals. They had proportionate features and healthy, normal facial structures that defy the modern characteristics of pituitary gigantism. They looked like they were simply supposed to be that size, a healthy population that warrants the massive infrastructure we see today. Beyond the photographs, the Earth itself has been trying to give up its secrets. Throughout the 1800s, newspaper articles across North America were filled with detailed accounts of giant skeletons being unearthed during mining operations and archaeological digs. We are talking about remains measuring 7, 8, and even 9 feet tall. In 1911, the Lovelock Cave discoveries in Nevada revealed remains between 8 and 10 feet tall, yet those records went quiet almost as soon as they were documented. You have to ask yourself why these findings were so common in the 1880s and then suddenly dried up completely by 1925. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was an abrupt erasure. We aren't just looking at a few tall people, we are looking at a subset of the human population that was removed from public life so completely that within a single generation, we forgot they ever existed. It suggests that the inheritance of Tartaria wasn't just about empty buildings, but about the people who were disappeared to make way for a history that didn't include them. The deeper I go into this research, the more I encounter a wall of absence. Not an argument or a denial, just a hollow, echoing nothingness. It is a chilling realization because the Victorians were obsessed with documentation. They measured every skull, cataloged every physical specimen, and created vast archives of human biological variation. Yet for a population consistently measuring 7 to 10 feet tall, appearing in photographs across decades and continents, there is only a deafening silence. Medical records that should exist have simply vanished. Census data with height recordings is gone. Even the photography studios that specialize in these portraits seem to burn down with a suspicious regularity that defies pure coincidence. But the most persistent name in this trail of disappearing evidence is the Smithsonian Institution. Time and again, historical reports show the Smithsonian acquiring skeletal remains from mound excavations and accepting donations of anomalous material from frontier discoveries. And every single time, those remains disappear into collections that researchers can no longer access, can no longer confirm existed, and can no longer trace through any official records. We have to ask why. Not just what happened to the bones, but why the systematic removal of these people from public knowledge? If these were simply medical outliers or pituitary cases, they would be studied and displayed as scientific curiosities. Instead, they are treated like a secret that could unravel the very foundation of our history. It suggests that the existence of such a population that could actually build the infrastructure of Tartaria, contradicted a narrative that someone was very busy constructing. The absence of explanation functions as its own answer. They don't explain because they can't without pulling the threads that would dismantle our entire understanding of the Industrial Revolution and urban development. Every time a museum collection is quietly donated away or lost in a mysterious administrative error, a piece of our true inheritance is buried deeper. We are left with buildings that don't fit and a silence that is far too heavy to be accidental. To truly understand why the world around us feels like a mismatched suit, we have to look at the name that has been whispered in the margins of geography for centuries: Tartaria. If you open an atlas from the 15th through the 19th centuries, you won't find a void or a blank space where Central Asia and Siberia should be. Instead, you will see a massive, sprawling territory designated as Tartaria, reaching from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the frozen edges of the Pacific. Modern historians try to brush this off as a mere catch-all term, a lazy label for regions Europeans didn't fully understand. But the maps tell a different story. They are remarkably detailed, showing intricate infrastructure, established cities, clear political boundaries, and complex trade routes. When you compare the architectural style of those mapped cities with the impossible grandeur we've discussed, the proportions and the scales match perfectly. Then around 1775, something shifted. Tartaria didn't just decline, it began to disappear from the maps. It wasn't a gradual transition as exploration revealed new truths. It was a sudden reclassification into the geopolitical divisions we recognize today: Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan, as if an entire global civilization was simply edited out of existence. What keeps me awake at night is how perfectly the timeline aligns. Tartaria vanishes from the maps between 1775 and 1850. Immediately following this erasure, from 1850 to 1920, we see the global construction boom of these impossibly scaled buildings across every continent. It wasn't a birth of new technology. It was a massive, coordinated effort to occupy what was already there. We are told this was the era of progress, but the evidence suggests it was the era of the Great Inheritance. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the work shifted from occupying to modifying, shrinking the doors and lowering the ceilings to hide the true stature of the original builders. We are living in the echoes of a deleted empire, walking through the halls of a civilization that was reclassified into myth because their existence made our own history look small. If you want to find the smoking gun of this entire investigation, you don't look at the blueprints of how these buildings were made. You look at the receipts for how they were changed. There is a haunting paper trail buried in the building maintenance records from the early 20th century. Not the construction records, which are often missing or conveniently inaccessible, but the modification invoices. Between 1920 and 1950, a silent, systematic transformation took place across dozens of cities. We find thousands of orders for work that makes no sense if we were the original builders. Invoices exist for lowering doorways from 13 feet 4 inches down to a standard 7 feet. There are countless records of installing drop ceilings to reduce room heights from 40 feet to something manageable for a modern furnace. We see window panes being replaced with smaller units and grand staircases being rebuilt with additional landings just to reduce the riser height to something a human leg can actually climb. What is most unsettling is the absolute lack of explanation in these documents. The contractors didn't ask why. They simply performed the quiet work of making the world fit the people who had inherited it. This wasn't a renovation. It was an adaptation. We didn't build these structures for our own needs. We moved into the remains of Tartaria and scaled them down. We took the grand, impossible proportions of a vanished civilization and forced them to match our smaller stature. And then we wrote history books that explained how the original grandeur was just aesthetic ambition. But aesthetic ambition doesn't require you to spend a fortune lowering a door frame. You only modify a building when the original design was meant for someone else entirely. Every false ceiling in an old bank and every narrow doorway in a Victorian manor is a physical confession that we are just the second tenants, trying to make ourselves comfortable in a house built for giants. The evidence suggests that the Industrial Revolution wasn't about building a new world, but about retrofitting an old one that was far more advanced than we are willing to admit. I started this investigation with a simple observation that the doorways didn't fit, but I am ending it with a question that has no comfortable answer. The strangest part of this entire journey isn't just the missing records or the modified buildings. It is the absolute silence. If everything I have shown you is truly a coincidence, a product of overactive theorizing, or a mere misunderstanding of Victorian style, then why is the truth so hard to access? Why do academic doors close and institutional emails go unanswered the moment you ask about the anomalous proportions of the 19th century? They don't explain because they can't. Not without pulling at the threads that would unravel the entire narrative of our modern civilization. We are left wandering through cities that were built by someone with capabilities we cannot fully explain, using engineering and precision that suggest either a lost technology or a population whose physical power far exceeded our own. We live in their shells, walking through their modified halls, stand dwarfed in their towering rooms, and we call it our history. But the evidence suggests we are just the inheritors who moved in after the builders of Tartaria vanished. We wrote new histories to explain what we found because the truth, that we didn't build any of this, was too destabilizing to admit. So I'm asking you to look up. The next time you enter a building from that era, really look at the proportions and measure the space with your own eyes. Ask yourself who could comfortably use that space without a single modification. The buildings are still there, the photographs exist, and the pattern once seen cannot be unseen. We are living in the remains of a world built for giants, and the silence suggests we aren't supposed to notice. They want us to stop asking, but that is exactly why we can't. Document what you see, share what you find, and remember the doors. Because somewhere in that gap between their 13-foot ceilings and our 8-foot reality is the truth about who we were taught to forget.